Hello everybody and welcome to this video where we will not talk about openings. In this video I would like to talk about games which easily go unnoticed when you're browsing the database or just looking at any games in a magazine or informator or anywhere. These types of games are usually relatively short draws by decent players, and even if quickly going over them, it appears as if nothing really happened in those games. So in this video I would like to show you that actually quite a lot of it happens, and none of that is seen on the surface. On the surface you only see moves that sometimes can look boring, but actually a lot of action happens that is not seen, and it happens in the minds of the players. So the game that I'm going to demonstrate, first I need to give you some background. First, about the players. With the white pieces, it was a Grandmaster Ilyushin, fairly solid Grandmaster. At the time of the game he was rated around 25-20. And with the black pieces it was yours truly, at the time rated around 24-70. The game was played in 2007 at the European Club Cup in Kemer in Turkey. Now, a bit more background about the game, and this is important to know because very often we don't know actually the background of the game that we are looking at. We don't know the intentions of the players before the game, the goals, the what they were hoping for to get in the game, and so forth. So the game was played at a fairly important stage of the team competition, and I was playing with the black pieces, and I remember that my captain told me that it was very important for me to play as solidly as possible, and that a draw actually would be a good result for us on that board in the match. So this is, again, I say, important to know because you will see that some of the decisions in the game were influenced by that objective given before the game. So these are the important things to know before the game. And now let's see what actually happened there. So d4 by my opponent, d5, c4, c6. Back in those days, the Slav was my main opening, and I have to say it served me pretty well. After all, using it, I made my final Grandmaster norm at that time. So knight f3, knight f6, e3. This is a way of being flexible in case black plays the semi-Slav with e6, because in that case white can vary the development, perhaps going bishop d3 and developing the knight to d2 rather than on c3. I was mostly playing e6 at the time, but for this game I prepared a surprise, and that was the move bishop g4. The drawback of white's move order with e3 is that allows bishop g4 and also bishop f5, both of these moves, bishop f5 being actually much more popular than bishop g4. But at the time I prepared bishop g4, and actually it's a quite good line even today. So it's a very simple idea: get the bishop out before getting e6 and establishing the triangle in the center. And this was the first major point for me in the game, because after the game my opponent admitted that he did not prepare for this. So you see, sometimes it's good to surprise your opponents by deviating from your usual lines. Well, thankfully I had a pretty wide repertoire, and I had looked at many lines, so I could do this fairly easily. So bishop g4, knight c3, e6, establishing the triangle. I talk about the triangle a lot for example, in my Chessable course on the Chebanenko Slav, and the general rule of thumb being that once the triangle is set up in place, black is insured against any trouble in the center. So h3, challenging the bishop, and now bishop takes f3. I remember reading that Anand prepared also this bishop g4 line for his match against Kramnik in 2008, just 1 year after this game was played, in fact. And I remember that many years later, he said that looking back, his preparation was not all that great as he thought back then. And he said that against h3, his plan was to go bishop h5. This is what he actually prepared for the match. But I decided to take on f3 because it's just a simpler position to play. Queen takes f3 and now bishop b4. Now I play this move because I'm fighting for the control over the e4 square. So I'm pinning the knight on c3 that controls the e4 square, and I'm trying to make the e4 push as difficult as possible for white. So bishop d2, breaking the pin, knight bd7, and in this position my opponent, I think it showed that he was surprised in the opening because he played c takes d5. And I would say that this is a bit premature because it just clarifies the situation in the center when it was not really forcing to do so. It wasn't really, white wasn't really pressed to do so. He could have tried bishop d3, short castle, yeah. And now, for example, there is this very nice trick in case of short castle. Knight c5 is actually a very nice move for black to make, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the two bishops on the d file. After d takes c5, d takes c4, black will regain the piece with an equal game. So white shouldn't really castle, should either go, should play probably a3, and now both moves are possible, going away back to a5 or taking on c3 and then going rook e8. And in these typical positions, the position is relatively closed, and even if black manages to go something like e5, then d5 knight e5 will ensure that black won't allow white to stay with a pair of bishops. So this is quite acceptable for black. So anyway, this was more flexible for white, but he played c takes d5, and this is the first point in the game where I have to make a decision, an important decision, and bear in mind what I said about the game. I was content with a draw. So with this in mind, I chose to capture in the more solid way with the c pawn, keeping the position symmetrical. What I didn't like about e5 was that after bishop d3, short castle g4 may be possible. And this leads to sharper play. It's not problematic for black at all. It's just that it changes the character of the game somewhat, and this is what I did not want to allow. So you see, this is like the first moment where you can see why a certain move was played. And it's easy to go like to simply miss this moment if you don't know actually what the player intended by even such a seemingly trivial decision to recapture the pawn on d5. So you see there is a lot of background, a lot of thinking, considerations that are actually happening, even let's say in such for such trivial decisions. So bishop d3 now, castles a3, yeah, and now again it may seem again completely harmless, yeah, a3 attacking the bishop, so where the bishop goes, but again the decision is actually taken because of consideration of my opponent's plans. So for example, bishop d6 would be, let's say, a natural move to make because d6 we know it's very often the best square for the bishop in these semi-Slav structures, even if it's an exchange Slav structure. But what I didn't like here is the move g4 again. So g5 and the knight will go to e8, and now you see that the knight would like to go to d6, but the bishop is taking that square. So again, a small decision, but again, it's made by taking into consideration an aggressive possibility of my opponent. So I went to a5. The point being that if g4 now, knight e8, and the knight comfortably slots back to d6, the ideal square for the knight also in these structures. Rook c8, knight c4, also controlling d4 square, and most importantly, there is nothing to attack on the king side. There is no knight on f6. So white, even if white goes say g5, h5, h4, h5, it's a long way to create something on the king side. So again, you will see it's a decision that you can easily miss. Well, if you're browsing through the game, okay, bishop a5, whatever, yeah, natural move. But the reason why it's taken, again, there is a concrete reason behind it. So short castle by white, and now rook e8. Now I did not quite like e5 in this position because of the move queen f5. Even though the engine actually says that's not the best move for white, and even the simple d takes e5, knight e5, queen f5, take on d3, queen d3, while perfectly fine for black, I thought that I wasn't forced to go for these types of IQP positions. Like I said, they're perfectly fine because white is pretty passive, and black can control the square in front of the pawn, and the pieces are coming to the center. It's quite active position for black, but I thought I'm not forced to go for this, so let's not rush, yeah, and let's prepare it. Rook e8. So it's a very useful preparational move for e5 later on when the rook will be well placed on the e file. In this position, my opponent played rook fd1. We are already at the beginning of the middle game, and here a lot of prophylactic thinking and strategic considerations come to the fore. So rook fd1. He could have put the other rook to d1. Yeah, he could have played b4. Yeah, various options. The position is quite complex. Even though the structure is symmetrical, there are still a lot of pieces on the board, so a lot of things can happen. So rook fd1, so I'm imagining that yeah, he'll put the other rook to c1, and then he will see what to do. There are basically two plans for him. One is to play something on the queen side, let's say b4, knight a4, knight c5, and the other one is to play in the center with e4. I was more concerned with the play in the center with e4, yeah, and that's why I was paying close attention to this. So for the time being nothing is threatened, so I play also a very useful move, rook c8, completing my development and awaiting further action. Yeah, so I'm staying flexible, the rook is active on the c file, all my pieces are developed now, so let's see what happens next. Now my opponent played the move queen e2. It's a prophylactic move because now after e5, d5, knight e5, there is no attack on the queen on f3. However, the engine, for example, indicates that rook ac1 would have been trickier and probably a better move. Now e5, this makes sense, yeah, because I'm trying to activate my position, because otherwise there is first a tactical threat after rook ac1. For example, if I play the move as in the game a6, that doesn't work because of the tactical trick knight takes d5. The point is that after rook c8, the queen will have to take on c8 and will no longer protect the bishop on a5, so white will regain the piece. So just to illustrate, let's say knight d5, okay, rook c8, queen c8, bishop a5, and white is a pawn up. A move like bishop b6, for example, is a prophylactic move, latching onto this pawn on d4 and stopping a possible e4. So then the pawn on d4 is attacked. But now knight b1, knight b5, sorry, is a bit problematic. Take on c1, take on c1. And now again, knight b8. It's possible to play like this, rerouting the knight, but it just looks that white has this free pressure. Yeah. So best chance for black is to go e5 to finally become active in the center. Now queen f5 is not so great because after g6, queen g5, e4, black obtains some good space advantage in the center and has good play. Bishop b5 also is met by e4, and black got some space in the center. The bishop may drop back to c7 and possibly some threats on the king side in the long term. Whereas d takes e5, knight takes e5, queen e2. Now there are two options for black. Eliminating the bishop pair is one. Knight d3, queen d3, and rook c6. This is similar to what I explained earlier on. But if back then I wasn't forced to go for this, here probably I would have had to play e5. Even though taking on d3 is not obligatory. Rook c6 is a useful move. Oops, sorry, rook c6 is a useful move because the rook can swing to d6, to e6, so just it enables for some doubling on the c file. Let's say like this, yeah. So this is acceptable for black, but it's also possible to keep the active knight on e5 and go a6. Useful move, controlling the b5 square. And after bishop b1 to drop the knight back to c6. And now we see how useful this rook on e8 is. There is immediate threat of d4. All the black pieces are well placed. White is passive. The bishop on d2 is particularly short of squares. And black already has this idea of d4 and with active play. So this would have basically forced me to go for e5. But he went queen e2. Okay. And again, I'm not quite sure what he wants to do. Okay. But I'm always on the lookout for the e4 break. Yeah. So for the time being, it's not a threat, because I can always take on c3 and then take on e4, and then I will eliminate one of the bishops, and then I will white will also remain with an isolated pawn on d4. So I play another useful move, a6. So useful move because there are two ideas here. One is if bishop b6, knight f4, the bishop may drop to a7 if required to keep control over the c5 square. And the second idea is that I can expand on the queen side with the move b5. And then maybe knight b6, knight c4. So I'm also thinking about my own active plans here on the queen side. And in this position, my opponent played the move bishop e1. And this already made things more concrete for me. I understood that there are two ideas behind this move bishop e1. One is to go f3, e4. And the bishop is removed from the d file, so the rook is controlling the d4 pawn, for example, if required. And the second idea is to go f4 and then bishop h4, to pin my knight on f6. Maybe go g4 later on and so on. So I have two ideas to deal with for white in this position. I thought that the one with f3 and e4 was the more important to deal with. So I played the move bishop c7. So again, you would think, okay, just the bishop no longer is doing much on a5. It comes back to c7. But in fact, it deals with both of white's ideas. It's very easy to miss these things unless you analyze very deeply or the player himself tells you what his ideas behind the moves were. So let me explain the prophylaxis behind the move bishop c7. In case of f3, this is the first plan, going e4. My idea was to go knight b6. And now I'm opening the d file for the queen, so e4 is not possible because I take on e4, and fe4 is not possible because queen d4 will be with check. That's one idea. And the second idea, e4 is not possible, but I still want to go queen d6 and threaten checks on h2, taking advantage of the fact that with f3, white weakened the dark squares. So this is the first prophylactic idea against f3, e4. The second prophylactic idea happened in the game. He went f4, so he's blocking my control over the dark squares. I go knight b6, f4, I go knight b6. The knight wasn't really useful on d7 anymore since e5 is no longer a threat. So knight b6, targeting the c4 square. And after bishop h4, bishop d6. This is the second prophylactic idea. From c7, the bishop goes to d6 and then to e7 to break the pin on my knight on f6. So you see these deep ideas, deep considerations that are easily, very hard to miss. Sometimes even analyzing deeply, it's hard to understand why the player played certain moves. So now after bishop d6, my idea is to go bishop e7 to break the pin and possibly go knight e4, attacking that bishop on h4. So in this position, my opponent goes g4. So he's finally trying to push a bit and play more aggressively. But my position, as you can see, is very solid. I have no weaknesses, and I can be patient. I go bishop e7, breaking the pin, g5, and knight fd7. Ideally, I would have liked to go knight e8, knight d6, but it's not possible, so I go knight fd7. So I'm still very compact, but white gained some space on the king side. The bishop on h4 is a bit out of play, and that's what my opponent does with his next move. He goes bishop f2, bringing it back. It's not a very active piece, but from f2, it controls the d4 pawn, and maybe e4 ideas are becoming possible again. So e4 being the idea, I again play a prophylactic move, bishop d6. I'm latching onto the pawn on f4, thus preventing e4. So you see, every move is very, very concrete. Behind every move, there is a concrete reason why it is played. So in this position, my opponent played a very interesting move, knight b1. So once you see a strange move like this, you immediately understand that there must be a concrete reason for this, and the reason, the rationale behind it is that the knight on c3 wasn't doing much, especially with my knight on b6. The ideas with knight f4, knight c5 are no longer feasible. So my opponent tries to reroute the knight to d2 from where there are two ideas: to go to b3 and still target this pawn, this square on c5, or to go to f3 and e5. So see a very deep maneuvering happening. Yeah? Like I said, on the surface, you go over this game, it may look like a boring game, but a lot is actually happening. So I go knight c4 now. Now I'm starting to be a bit more active myself. I plant a knight on c4, good piece, but then you would say, why knight c4 when you can just be pushed back with b3? But this was in fact my idea. I wanted to provoke b3 when these two pawns b3 and a3 are rather loose. So after b3 I played knight a5, latching onto the pawn on b3, and the bishop on d6 is latching onto the pawn on a3. I have ideas like queen e7 to put even more pressure on that pawn on a3. So by provoking b3, I'm actually trying to create a counterplay on the queen side by targeting these two pawns and forcing white to defend them, thus deflecting him from, let's say, an unhurried way to build up on the king side. In fact, after the game, my opponent said that he missed this idea of knight a5. He played knight d2, defending the pawn on b3, and now I played the move knight b6. Again, it's a prophylactic move because with the knight on d2, there is already the threat of b4, and then I can't land on c4 because white simply controls it 3 times, and he would just take my pawn. So I go knight b6, and now b4 would be met by landing on c4. And in this moment, actually the game finished. Maybe you're surprised or disappointed, but remember what I said before starting the analysis. A team match, and I understood, and I was instructed to play as solidly as possible, and that a draw was a good result. So what happened is that in this position I offered a draw. I actually did not expect that my opponent would accept, because the position is still full of life and there is a lot to play. So I made this decision, I made this offer more on a psychological basis with two ideas in mind. One was to basically get more time on the clock, because apart from thinking about the position now, what to play, white also needs to think about whether to accept the draw or not. So this another thought enters my opponent's mind. And the second idea was to kind of put the psychological pressure on my opponent, because I'm saying, okay, I think the position is kind of equal, I'm doing fine, I played well. But if you think you're better, and if you think that you should refuse the draw, well, show me. You should play something more aggressively, you should kind of try to come at me, and okay, I think my position is pretty solid, and I think I can withstand any pressure. So these were the reasons I offered the draw, and to my slight surprise, but not disappointment, my opponent actually accepted, and the game finished in a draw. So you see a game like this and you say, nothing happened really here. Like, look at this position at the end, there's still a lot to play. Why did they make a draw? But you see, I tried to explain why actually the game ended in a draw at this point, and also the reasons behind basically every single move that the opponents played in this relatively short game. Now, not to give you completely disappointed, I will just analyze a little bit the final position. After knight b6, like I said, my ideas were to go queen e7 to target the pawn on a3, but also there is this idea of rook c3 targeting the pawn on b3. Yeah. So after knight b6, actually what the engine wants to do is to sacrifice that pawn on a3 and to go h4, queen e7, and knight f3. It looks pretty vague to a human, and I'm not sure many would would play like this, because after bishop a3, knight e5, knight c6, getting away from the possible pin and challenging the knight on e5, knight g4 now. There is a very interesting move, knight takes f7, and if king f7, there is queen h5 and so forth. So queen f7, rook a3, this regains the pawn, but after knight e7, the knight can come to f5, and the position remains pretty sharp. But in this relatively close position, the knights are not inferior to the bishops, especially this one on f2 is very passive and can't find some active thing to do, basically. So this is interesting and pretty sharp. And in case of knight g4, bishop d6, f5, knight d7, again, black regrouped, all the pieces are concentrated in the center, and white has some activity, but at first sight this doesn't really look like something tangible for white, especially like the pieces are way back, like the rooks, the queen, and the bishop on f2. It doesn't feel like they're supporting enough this pawn advance. So at least visually this is very hard for white to decide on something like this, whereas the engine is quite happy. Okay, objectively it's unclear, but the engine is quite happy to play like this. So again, the position would have been pretty sharp, and I think the chances of white playing like this would have been minimal. Yeah. In case of b4, like I said, my idea was to go knight ac4. And in case of after knight b3, white trying to do the same I did on the same c4 square. He wants to land the knight on c5, but I can go knight a4. And even here, it's clear that visually black is doing quite all right. There is the threat of knight c3, winning the exchange. And after rook dc1, knight b2, going after this bishop on d3, it's quite black is quite active here. And obviously, things are happening on the queen side, and the advanced pawns on the king side, well, don't really matter much, and even can't be said that white achieved something by advancing these pawns. So with this, I will conclude the analysis of the game. I hope you found something interesting here. Like I said, on the surface, the moves, the game looks pretty boring. Nothing happened, but you have two not the best players in the world, but not too shabby players either, playing a game of chess where they tried to understand each other's thoughts, ideas, applied some prophylactic thinking, played a decent game, even by computer standards. It wasn't a bad game at all. Perhaps it was prematurely finished, but in order to understand this, you need to understand the background of the game, which I explained at the beginning. So, chess is a rich game. Even if you see sometimes a boring game, don't dismiss it outright. Try to understand what the players wanted to do, what the players intended with their moves, and you may find joy there as well. So, thanks for watching this video. Again, as always, if you like my work, make sure you check out my Chessable courses, subscribe to my Substack. If you really like my work, you can also become a paid subscriber to my Substack. You will receive one weekly newsletter every Saturday with a link to that day's video. So guys, thanks for watching, and before I go, make sure you smash that subscribe button and keep on watching, because I'll see you soon again. Cheers.